I'm Sheldon Neil. Concerns are in the air about two COVID-19 vaccines as Canada is dealing with one of the highest rates of new cases in the world. Quebec's Health Ministry and Public Health Agency of Canada reported the country's first case of vaccine-induced blood clots linked to the Oxford AstraZeneca shot. Quebec says it has given out 185,000 doses of AstraZeneca so far, and the woman's reaction is the first and only clotting report. The Prime Minister spoke on vaccine concerns.
We are still on track to receiving our first shipment of the Johnson & Johnson Janssen vaccine by the end of this month. But obviously, we're following closely developments in the United States, and we can assure everyone that Health Canada will, every step of the way, put the health of Canadians first and foremost.
Vaccines are going into arms at a rate of almost 7 per 1,000 Canadians per day, up from 5 just 2 weeks ago. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole said in the House of Commons the Liberal government's failure to secure adequate vaccine supply has led to a catastrophic third wave of COVID-19.
The Prime Minister made CNN last night. The headline, Canada's vaccine shortage. Jake Tapper told viewers around the world that the Canadian government had failed. Will the Prime Minister admit that his failure to secure sufficient vaccines is leading to a catastrophic third wave?
The Prime Minister responded Canada is third out of G20 countries in terms of vaccines delivered to residents. The federal Liberals are hoping to prove they are serious about childcare with next week's federal budget. Sources with knowledge of the government's plans tell the Canadian press the funding for provinces is expected to be tied to specific outcomes such as reducing fees and expanding the number of spaces. There is also talk about putting the new child care spending into law to prevent it from being easily watered down or canceled by a new government. WestJet says it will extend its temporary suspension of international Sun flights to destinations in Mexico and the Caribbean until June 4th. Canadian Airlines suspended all flights to Sun destinations in January at the request of the federal government. WestJet President and CEO Ed Sims says it made the decision to extend the April 30th end date with the clear expectation that as more Canadians are vaccinated, government policy will change. WestJet will notify all guests with affected itineraries, adding it has been providing refunds since November for all travelers where it initiated flight cancellations. A new report suggests Canada is growing ever more reliant on imported American oil. The Canada Energy Regulator says the U.S. provided 77% of the foreign oil that was imported in 2020. That's way up from 2010, when imports from the U.S. were just 6%. Darren Christie, the regulator's chief economist, says it suggests cross-border energy pipelines are a key component of meeting oil and gas needs in both Canada and the U.S. A national study led by researchers in Halifax is looking at the effects of radon gas and arsenic exposure on the human body. Experts from across the country are examining the two primary environmental exposure carcinogens that affect people's risk of getting cancer. Dr. Graham Dallaire, who is leading the study, hopes the knowledge gained can assist health policy in Canada. He says it could help doctors better communicate the risks of arsenic and give patients the desire to have their blood or toenails tested for exposure. Yukon residents will have to wait a bit longer to find out what their government will look like. Monday's vote ended in a tie between the incumbent Liberals and the Yukon Party in the riding of Old Crow. Dan Cable, the clerk of the territory's Legislative Assembly, says now that the voters have done their work, the legislation will decide what happens next. Yukon's election legislation says if a recount determines a tie, the winner's name will be drawn out of anything from a coffee cup to a hat. The commander of Canada's military police told members of a parliamentary committee his officers are not beholden to the top brass. Provost Marshal Brigadier General Simon Trudeau was grilled yesterday over how military police deal with cases of sexual misconduct. He suggested the process of charging any senior leader would be no different than for the lowest ranking member of the Canadian Armed Forces. Stay with us. More up and more news coming up after this. Our weekly Tia Health Medical segment. We'll talk with Dr. Abhishek Raut from Appletree Medical Group when we return. This and more national and international news coming your way on the Forum Daily. We'll be right back. According to a report last year, due to the pandemic, many Canadians are passing over proactive cancer screening or diagnosis of potential cancers. This leaves many doctors to believe an increase in advanced tumors and deaths is on the horizon. According to the Quebec Health Ministry, more than 4,000 people who normally get diagnosed last year went undiagnosed. In Ontario, the health minister announced this week the province will add hundreds of critical care beds as COVID-19 infections soar. In the meantime, hospitals have been instructed to cancel elective surgeries except in, quote, absolutely life and death cases. The potential lack of ICU beds due to COVID-19 is causing concerns for those facing other serious illnesses. Here to help us unpack it all is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director with the Appletree Medical Group. He joins me now. Welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks so much, Sheldon.
Pre-screening of patients with no symptoms and diagnosis of people thought to possibly have cancer dropped when the pandemic began. What could account for this?
I think this is a great question and a great topic. The preventative health is really affected by quite a few different variables. Age, for example, younger adults tend not to seek preventative health screenings. Health of the patient in general, comorbidities can certainly interfere with that, and accessibility of the healthcare provider. We as physicians, we always push for preventative screenings because it's not very often that a patient would want to do those screenings. It's usually the doctor who recommends them while they're likely there for something else. And this was, of course, all pre-COVID with these challenges. COVID has, of course, added a whole nother dimension, as you correctly mentioned as well, a very different dynamic where the patient at this point was supposed to stay home as much as possible to minimize risk and perhaps not seek out healthcare when they need it there.
Prostate cancer particularly took a dive with fewer biopsies. What would make prostate cancer stand out in your thoughts?
If we look at the screening steps for a lot of different cancers, you see the imaging can be pretty good. For instance, mammograms, breast ultrasounds are helpful in determining risk. For prostate imaging, it's not that helpful, actually. We rely on a digital rectal examination and a PSA blood test, both of which, again, are not that great. And so even then, once we have a patient in one of those flags, we have to then send them to a biopsy. So prostate cancer is a bit unique where there's so many stages to actually getting properly screened that it turns out to be quite a barrier and likely would be the reason why it's so low here.
Some experts say restrictions by the healthcare system itself is one of the reasons for the decline in diagnosis. What healthcare restrictions currently exist in the healthcare system that could be causing the decline?
I think it's an evolving area. In mid-March of last year, Ontario had actually put screening programs like breast, cervical, and colorectal cancers on hold. And that was just in an effort to pool all the available resources to deal with the pandemic. This is not something that's new to Ontario, so that was certainly a large barrier. The second barrier, of course, is, and the biggest one, is we do have limited resources. Every physician, every hospital bed, every surgery plays a monumental role in healthcare, but all of those need to be redirected.
So if we're talking solutions now, testing numbers are beginning to return to better levels, but certain cancer screenings are still low. How do we fix this?
I think what you're doing right now is absolutely what we need. We need people to know the importance of screenings and put that as an important topic for them. And we need people to understand that their doctor's offices are open and they can see them virtually or in person for those screenings.
What are the long-term concerns over the possible delays in elective surgeries and restrictions due to hospital capacity?
So if we look at just 2020 numbers, we would say that about 44,000 men in Canada would have died from any sort of cancer, and about 39,000 women. What that means is, on average, we have about 617 Canadians that would be diagnosed with cancer every day. And on average, we have about 228 Canadians who would die from cancer every day. So my concern with this is if we really don't reprioritize screenings, those numbers are going to go way up.
I have about 25 seconds for this. Overall, people need to get comfortable with going back to their doctor to get the health issues checked out, etc. 20 seconds for this. What's your advice moving forward?
I would absolutely agree with that statement. Everyone should take 5 minutes today to call your family doctor's practices or book online to get a preventative screening checkup. I think this will be the best and most valuable 5 minutes you'd spend.
Thank you so much for those insights. Definitely appreciate it. Thank you again.
Thanks so much.
A look across Canada coming up after the break. We start in BC, where it's been 5 years since overdoses were declared a public health emergency, and Alberta joins 3 other provinces in exploring small-scale nuclear technology. Stay with us. More news after this. BC marks 5 years since overdoses were declared a public health emergency. Sheila Malcolmson, Mental Health and Addictions Minister, says COVID-19 has had a large impact on people who use drugs. She says the government is committed to decriminalization, but advocates say the government needs to take decisive action. An industry group representing the BC restaurant and food industry says it has been told current in-dining restrictions will be extended through to May. The BC Restaurants and Food Association says Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry told them during a meeting yesterday the restrictions would extend as the province dealt with a high number of COVID-19 cases. In dining at restaurants and bars was originally restricted until April 19th. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is urging the public to hold on a bit longer for things to return to normal following a COVID-19 lockdown.
In the coming weeks, we'll be able to say that almost a quarter of Albertans have some degree of immunity either through the vaccines or from prior infection. By the end of May, it's expected to be almost half with that level of protection. And by the end of June, we anticipate that about 2/3, and by mid-September, almost 3/4 of Albertans will have protective immunity.
Premier Kenney says with more vaccines coming, 3/4 of Albertans should have had at least one shot by mid-September. Alberta will join 3 other provinces today in signing a memorandum of understanding related to exploring small-scale nuclear technology. Premier Jason Kenney and his Conservative counterparts in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick will explore the feasibility of small modular nuclear reactors as a clean energy option. The Alberta government said last summer it would enter into the agreement to help diversify its energy sector. The Country Thunder Music Festival in Calgary is canceled this year thanks to the pandemic. Festival organizers have rescheduled the event for August 19th to 21st, 2022. Country Thunder CEO Troy Volhofer says 2021 tickets will be honored for the 2022 event. The festival takes place at Prairie Winds Park in northeast Calgary. Saskatchewan is tightening restrictions province-wide on group sizes and how many people can attend worship services as the number of COVID-19 cases continues to surge. Health Minister Paul Merriman says the level of transmission remains too high in many parts of the province. Effective immediately, only people living under the same roof are to be present in a home. As of Friday, church gatherings will be restricted to no more than 30 people. The Manitoba Wildfire Service says it is lifting all fire and travel restrictions in the southwest part of the province because of this week's snowstorm. The province has lifted restrictions in areas including Spruce Woods Provincial Park and Forest, Turtle Mountain and William Lake Provincial Parks. Officials say residents should double-check with municipal offices to make sure burning restrictions have been lifted before lighting anything on fire. Ontario offered more details on its plan to vaccinate residents 18 and over in COVID-19 hotspots yesterday. Community groups and large employers will be enlisted to organize immunization clinics in certain high-risk neighborhoods, according to the Ontario government. The specifics came days after Premier Doug Ford said all adults in certain priority postal codes would be eligible for a shot, an announcement that frustrated some people when residents of those areas couldn't find specifics. Concerns are being raised again about the rising number of domestic violence cases in Quebec following the laying of charges against a 46-year-old man in connection with his partner's recent death. Victims advocates, as well as Quebec's deputy premier, have raised the alarm about 9 killings of women this year, allegedly linked to domestic violence. Diane Neuron, the director of a women's shelter, believes the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened a pre-existing problem. A bill introduced in Nova Scotia will designate August 1st as Emancipation Day in the province. That's the date of the anniversary of the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. The British Parliament outlawed the owning, buying, and selling of humans as property throughout its colonies on that day in 1834. The Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs, Tony Innes, says commemorating the day with a non-statutory holiday gives residents an opportunity to educate themselves on the history of slavery in the province. Stay tuned for top stories from around the world coming up after the break. Israel marks National Remembrance Day. Facebook will allow appeals over content moved from their site. And Canada sees a special World War I memorial project completed in Turkey. Stay with us, more to come right after this break. American officials say U.S. President Joe Biden will withdraw all troops from Afghanistan by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the infamous terrorist attacks that were coordinated from that country. The decision defies a May 1st deadline for full withdrawal under a peace agreement the Trump administration reached with the Taliban last year. President Biden has been hinting for weeks he was going to let the May deadline lapse, as an orderly withdrawal would be difficult and unlikely. Police clashed with protesters for a third night in the Minneapolis suburb of Brooklyn Center, where a police officer fatally shot a black man in a traffic stop Sunday. The police chief described the shooting as an accidental discharge, explaining the officer apparently intended to fire her taser, not her handgun, as 20-year-old Dante Wright struggled with fellow officers. Both the chief and the police officer resigned Tuesday. Iran's president today called Tehran's decision to enrich uranium up to 60% after an attack at a nuclear site, quote, an answer to your evilness. Israel, which hasn't commented on the attack, is suspected of carrying out last weekend's assault at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. The escalation in enrichment could see further retaliation, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed never to allow Tehran to obtain a nuclear weapon. Israel has marked its National Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and civilians killed in militant attacks, with people standing at attention while a 2-minute siren sounded around the country. This year's observances were marked by a national discussion about treatment for veterans suffering for psychological trauma after a former Israeli soldier set himself on fire. Hong Kong's electoral reform bill has been introduced in the city's legislature, this setting in motion changes that will give Beijing greater control over the process while reducing the number of directly elected representatives. The bill is part of efforts to rein in political protests and opposition in Hong Kong, which is part of China but has a more liberal political system since the 1997 handover from Britain. Somalia's president has signed into law an extension of his mandate and that of his government as the United States and others threaten sanctions and warn of further instability in one of the world's most fragile countries. Critics say President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed's time in office is over. The international community has warned the al-Qaeda-linked al-Shabaab extremist group could take advantage of the country's heated political divisions. Any users upset with Facebook about removing their posts from the site now have some recourse in the matter. The social networking giant says it will start letting users file appeals over posts, photos, and videos that are taken down. Disputes will be handled by Facebook's oversight board. Facebook set up the oversight panel last year in response to complaints it wasn't doing enough to tamp down flare-ups of hate speech, misinformation, and other harmful content on the social network. Guatemala's Congress has refused to swear in a female judge to the nation's highest court. This a move the United States condemned. Gloria Porras won re-election for another 5-year term on Guatemala's Constitutional Court, but she has faced constant challenges from those linked to corruption and other cases she has judged. State Department official Julie Chung wrote Tuesday's move by Congress, quote, undermines Guatemala's commitment to an independent judiciary and addressing systemic corruption, end quote. Leaders in the Caribbean island of St. Vincent say water is running short as heavy ash from volcanic eruptions contaminates supplies. They estimate the island will need hundreds of millions of dollars to recover from the eruption of La Soufrière. Up to 20,000 people have been evacuated from the island's northern region. Experts say volcanic activity could continue there for weeks. Newfoundland and Labrador is reporting after nearly a decade of efforts, the commemoration of the province's involvement in the First World War is complete. The province says a 6 bronze caribou monument has been erected in Gallipoli, Turkey, completing the Trail of the Caribou. The monument honors the Royal Newfoundland Regiment's involvement in the Gallipoli campaign from 1915 to 1916. The commemoration project was first started in 2012 as part of the Honor 100 initiative. Well, I'm Sheldon Neil, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For news on demand, visit our website at thenewsforum.ca. And make sure to follow our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our news and commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us on the Forum Daily. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.